Our next speaker, Joel Thompson, is Director of AfriCurrency, a business consultancy dedicated to complementary currencies in Africa. And the topic of his presentation is combining natural savings and parallel planting in Kenya, which to me personally is very interesting to hear. So please, Joel.
Right, well thanks for that introduction. I'm going to talk to you today about combining natural savings and parallel planting in Kenya. So let me just break down some of those terms so that we have some clear definitions from the start so that you know what I'm talking about, because the title might be a little bit convoluted. So combining natural savings, or what is natural savings? Natural savings is a green complementary currency concept which has been developed by Bernard Litter and Marek Hudon, and that dates to a paper in 2005. Parallel planting is an existing methodology on the ground in Kenya today. It's also known as Planet Positive. It's run by African Forest, which is a limited company. And the basis of it is planting indigenous tree varieties alongside exotic trees, which are presently grown for timber by farmers and landowners. Green currency, I'm going to be using this term to talk about any sort of a complementary currency which is backed by an organic growth process or renewable energy in some kind of a unit. Indigenous forest stewardship, mostly talking about the protection and advancement of indigenous forests and plantations in Kenya. So overall, just to give a summary of what this presentation will be about, it will be about uniting the conceptual nature of natural savings with the practical success of parallel planting to realise a complementary currency instrument which will further and advance indigenous forest stewardship. So let me start off with a little bit of a background and a context to the state of Kenya's indigenous forests. At the moment, closed canopy forests have declined from about 8% in 1990 to 1.96% in 2010. Nevertheless, about 60% of the national grid's electricity comes from hydropower, which is highly dependent on water of adequate quantity and quality delivered by the forests of Kenya. Similarly, around 70 to 80% of Kenyans depend on charcoal and firewood for domestic consumption. In terms of the societal impact of the decimation of Kenya's forests, the NCCRS, which is the National Climate Change Response Strategy of the Government of Kenya, acknowledges climate change as unmistakable and intensifying at an alarming rate. And this has been evidenced most recently with the cumulative failure of the long rainy season in Kenya, which you may have seen in news reports from last year, but it's actually ongoing. Political impact of the environmental degradation of the forests. The UN has identified diminishing resources and conflict over resources as a key contributor to the post-election crisis and violence of 2008. In terms of policy, there's been plenty of documents and other things promulgated by the government of Kenya to try and protect the forests. Here are some. Here we have the rehabilitation and protection of indigenous forests as one of Kenya Vision 2030's flagship projects. Now, Kenya Vision 2030 is a development blueprint for the country, spanning from 2010 to 2030, I believe it is. At the same time, Kenya Vision 2030 has a central pillar, which is 10% annual GDP growth rate, sustained over the years until 2030. So whether or not 10% annual GDP growth rate can be reconciled with the protection of the forests is a question which I won't be talking about in this presentation, but in my paper I consider it a little bit and touch upon it a little bit. And here are some international conventions to which Kenya is a party. So why green CCs? What is the value of using a green complementary currency to protect the indigenous forests of Kenya? Well, the decoupling of the money supply from the natural limits. Here I'm referring to the monoculture of global debt money, which is in no way connected to the limits of the planet, or the ability of the biosphere and ecosystems in Kenya to regenerate and replenish themselves. Now, for more information on this, I would refer you to Shan Turnbull's work, who's written numerous papers on this subject. Within this monetary economic paradigm, there are quite a few limitations to traditional eco-friendly industries such as ecotourism, mainly because of the marginal growth which is required within a GDP growth model. So for ecotourism to contribute to the annual growth rate target of 10%, you need marginal gains in ecotourism, which is not possible even if it was to be desirable. So the suggestion here is to tether the money supply of a local currency to the growth process of Kenya's indigenous trees. And by doing so, creating some kind of a micro monetary economic paradigm shift, which would bypass the current monetary economic paradigm to add resilience to parallel planting projects. And we'll move on to that soon. So some of the green CC design considerations to be made might be the unit of value. So could it be one tree standing as it is, protected over the course of 1 year? Or could it be 10 years of growth of an indigenous tree? Could that count as 1 unit? There are other considerations of eco-mimicry in terms of how to imitate the diversity of ecosystems and bring that into a currency design. Anthropology is important in the context of Kenya, because you have to consider traditional concepts of economics in Africa and value, traditional concepts of wealth and value as well. So let's move on to natural savings. So natural savings, as I briefly mentioned at the very beginning, it's a tool developed by Marie-Claude Bernard-Leterre. It's quite simply a micro savings tool which is issued to labourers who plant indigenous trees, or landowners, farmers. When you plant an indigenous tree, in fact, if you plant any tree, in the case of natural savings, it applies to all sorts of organic growth process, so it might be fisheries as well. Natural savings basically issues a share, like a tree share, which grows in value over time as the tree grows to maturity. The reason being that as the tree grows over time, ever closer you're approaching the time in which the tree can be harvested for timber. So in that sense, it's a micro savings tool, because if you hang on to it, it grows in value over time, which is important in inflationary environments such as Kenya, because if you hold on to national money, when you have an inflation rate of around 17–18%, the national money becomes worth very little very quickly. So the incentive is to spend very quickly before the money loses its value. And as a consequence of that, you have a short-term horizon for many farmers and forest community residents who are focusing on spending the national money as quickly as possible because of the inflationary nature of the Kenyan environment. So to summarize that, by issuing some kind of a currency in advance of receiving the monetary benefit of, say, logging or timber, you find a way to provide some kind of a quasi-payment for anticipated revenue from trees or some other natural resource. Parallel planting. Well, let me say from the outset that parallel planting in no way uses a complementary currency at the moment, so it's completely separate. This is an existing project on the ground in Kenya. It's a methodology developed by African Forest. Officially, it's called Planet Positive. The basic methodology is planting indigenous trees alongside exotic varieties. Now, the present practice for many landowners is to plant exclusively exotic varieties of trees, such as eucalyptus. The reason being that they grow fast, you can harvest them quickly for timber, and you can make money. Indigenous trees, on the other hand, grow slowly. They're more suitable to the environment. They are more suitable to the endemic biodiversity and migratory patterns of species and so forth. But they are not attractive as a monetary, as a source of revenue for farmers or landowners. Now, the model for parallel planting is not based on donor funding. It's based on investors investing in a plantation, let's say 1,000 or 10,000 hectares. The money comes in, the plantation is developed, indigenous trees are planted alongside exotic varieties, so farmers can continue to derive a revenue from exotic varieties, but at the same time, they will derive a revenue from standing indigenous trees. because standing indigenous trees deliver all sorts of non-timber forest products. Medicines, essences, sustainable charcoal, royal jelly, honey, all sorts of different things. So in that sense, when you have all of these different products, non-timber products, you have different investment products within the plantation, or maybe exclusively in one plantation. So, when you combine natural savings with parallel planting, and you find a way to integrate the two, you have a combined instrument.
Just move it down so it's hardly on the screen and don't repeat.
Oh yeah, he's right.
Okay, just stay down there.
That's really weird. Typical Windows.
No. Change focus.
It's fine. What's the issue?
It's stirring you all the time.
Can I carry on?
Yes.
Okay. So when you combine the two, you can operationalize a useful financial tool to advance indigenous forest cover and stewardship. By issuing a parallel planting complementary currency, you provide a variety of favourable returns in the short term, medium term and long term. So in short term, for instance, the issuance of parallel planting currency in return for protecting and growing and protecting extant, that's standing indigenous trees. So in the case of A, these trees may not have any plans within a project agreement to be harvested for non-timber products. However, it's still relevant to find a way to incentivize their protection. And so the parallel planting complementary currency can be issued for that purpose. In the medium term, as I said earlier, exotic tree varieties can continue to be grown and harvested for timber. So in no way is the complementary currency which I'm proposing here impinging on the current ability for farmers and landowners to derive revenue from exotic tree varieties. In the long term, with trees which are sown, planted and grown for non-timber products, which will be marketed and sold, and therefore develop into providing a revenue stream, there is potential to issue PPCC for that purpose as well. So in return for the labour of planting indigenous tree varieties. And in that sense, it functions as micro savings because the value of PPCC grows over time. Microfinance because it can provide the finance for labourers and farmers to plant the trees. And a microcurrency because it acts as a medium of exchange. So it can be used amongst forest community residents to exchange products and participating businesses. And here it is in visual form, which is always, I find, more useful. So this is very crude, really, but on the far left, you can use this. Project implementer will pay landowners, farmers, and CFAs, that's community forest associations, which are supported by the Kenyan government, with PPCC. Now, in return for receiving the parallel planting complementary currency, we have two tracks. Landowners will either be protecting standing trees, indigenous trees, and in that case, the PPCC will function as a local medium of exchange and micro savings, because the longer that you're protecting these standing trees, the more will be issued to you. Or on this track, the same group of people may be involved in growing indigenous tree varieties, right from saplings, for non-timber harvesting of non-timber forestry products. So in that sense, again, the PPCC can be used as a medium of exchange. It's a micro savings, as we saw here, but it will also be exchangeable for national money once these products are marketed and sold. Now, in parallel with these two activities, exotic trees, as I said earlier, can be grown for timber, and the function they provide there is payment in national money, which in Kenya is the Kenyan shilling. So, as a result, some of the direct beneficiaries are the project implementer, because they have a source of financing for their plantations in the form of labour. They have a source of financing from investors who can see that there is financial resilience added to parallel planting projects through a currency like the PPCC. Residents, small and medium-sized businesses, landowners, farmers, CFAs can derive an additional source of income which is stable and tethered to the growth of an indigenous process, an indigenous energy process of the trees. So in that sense as well, in an inflationary environment like Kenya, you have a way of tackling that inflation, altering the culture for longer term horizons in terms of planning. Because you know that you have a stable instrument which can be relied upon, which will grow in value, and therefore you can have more of a resilient approach to your economic aspirations. Right, let's move on. So, in conclusion, some of the benefits of the PPCC: environmental. We have the reduction in forest fragmentation, which is a serious problem at the moment in Kenya, and in the paper there are some images relating to that. Climate regulation and watershed management. As discussed right at the beginning, climate change is unmistakable in the words of the government of Kenya, and therefore this is a critical area which needs to be addressed. Socio-economic, we have the injection of additional purchasing power for forest community residents in the form of PPCC, which is circulated. It encourages savings, long-term planning, profitability in the form of growing trees, indigenous trees, and the possibility to, through the microfinance aspect of the currency, to scale up the parallel planting projects, to apply them in other parts of Kenya. And of course there's the additional resilience of diversifying currencies and providing that micro monetary economic paradigm shift away from the monoculture of the Kenyan shilling as it is in Kenya. Political, well, in particular the impact of climate refugees and of environmental refugees, the conflict of shrinking resources, has a real toll on political stability in Kenya, which is one of the least politically stable in the world according to foreign policy. So this is an important thing as well. And finally, the PPCC therefore can improve profitability, it can improve economic security, and it can appeal to investors by boosting the financial resilience of that's parallel planting projects. And that's all I have to say on that. So thank you very much.
Yeah.